A warm welcome to you all this evening for tonight's discussion of antibiotic resistance presented by Matthew Edwards and Ross Hamilton of the Institute and Faculty's Antibiotic Resistance Working Party, which is rather appropriately being held here at the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. Antibiotic resistance is clearly an important topic that goes well beyond the narrow world of actuaries, but it will clearly have an impact on a lot of work that actuaries do. And tonight we have two members of the Institute and Faculty's Antibiotic Resistance Working Party. Firstly, we have Matthew Edwards, who works for Willis Towers Watson. And Matthew leads their life underwriting risk offerings in the UK insurance practice for Willis Towers Watson. And he's focused on longevity, mortality, and policyholder behaviour, and advises other territories, primarily the US and EMEA, on suitable approaches where necessary. Ross Hamilton works for Lloyds Banking Group and has been working in pensions asset and liability modelling over the past 8 years, most recently as an in-house actuary within the pension risk management team at Lloyds Banking Group. His role involves projecting around 45 billion of the group's pension assets and liabilities, where assumptions around future trends in mortality is clearly a key factor. So this leads to his participation in the working party. So could I invite you both to present your findings of the working party to us?
I suppose so. Right, thanks very much indeed, all of you for coming here and for inviting us up. It's a very great honour. Thank you for those who eventually might be watching at home in YouTube for inviting us into your house or wherever you watch these things. It was very convenient, actually, the two Alan aspects. Initially, I was a bit confused seeing the two Alans in the email chain the last few days, and I thought it was actually quite nice. I just have to say thank you, Alan, at appropriate points in the evening, not really worry too much about exactly who it is I'm speaking to, so it all works quite nicely. So antibiotic resistance, very interesting subject. I think everyone can sort of relate to it, and it has relevance to pretty much every part of the profession, sort of term assurance obviously, but also pension funds, impacts in economic aspects. And in fact, some of the major papers that have been published to date have been looking more at the economic aspect than the mortality aspect. So hopefully something of interest to everyone. So much fun you won't even want to claim your CPD. So the agenda, when you get sent these IFOA templates, there's a sort of interesting flowchart slide I sort of felt obliged to use. I thought I'd use it for the agenda, give it a nice sort of shape instead of just bullet points. So introduction, and then want to go into a bit of detail on the medical, sort of, if you like, epidemiological background, and then pass over to Ross, who will start talking through the model structure and the parameterisation, and we'll then sort of look at alternate aspects of the results, and that should allow a good amount of time for Q&A, and hopefully you will find interesting, and hopefully there will be lots of interesting interjections. So working party background, why did this all get started? Well, I sit on the Mortality Research Steering Committee, and throughout 2015 we'd been agitating for some sort of event at Stapleton to sort of get a few people together and talk about ABR, because it seemed to be sort of increasing sort of interest in terms of what was being published. So we had this event which also tied in with the publication of a longevity bulletin with an antibiotic resistance theme, and that seemed to sort of spur a great deal of interest. We had a very interesting introduction from the Chief Medical Officer of England and Wales. We had this very sort of, if like, prominent or striking quotation that quite possible, perhaps even likely, that the recent era of mortality improvements would give way to many years of material mortality worsening. So potentially a very sort of shocking thing coming along. And we basically felt that we sort of needed to be looking at it in more detail and producing a model that everybody in the profession could then use and sort of flex to their own, for their own fun, for their own assumption setting, given that the reports that had come out previously, sort of O'Neill and the sort of the underlying RAND and KPMG models hadn't really allowed any sort of public access into what they were doing. So the main aims were developing a simple modelling framework with plausible parameterisation for actuaries to then take away and play with. And this all kicked off in January 2017, which seems like only yesterday, but it was, I guess, 2 years and a month ago. And we're sort of almost finished. So I should, I guess, at this point, apologise for not having had the sessional paper itself and the model on the website. We've sort of been continually retweaking the model over the last few weeks, but that's sort of finished pending a bit of checking, so that should be going up very soon. Likewise, the sessional paper is pretty much finished pending further checks on footnotes and endnotes and the fun things like that. So although you might be coming here cold, hopefully it'll still be all quite tangible and easy to understand. So working party members, there's me, Nicola Oliver, somebody who you may have seen at presentations and conferences before. So she sort of works for a firm called Medical Intelligence, and she's provides sort of medical input into all of this. And rather annoyingly for both of us, although she actually lives quite near Edinburgh, she couldn't make today's date, so I'm sort of bluffing her part. Sheridan Fitzgibbon, Legal and General, did a lot of work on the model structure and data analysis and so on, and then had to sort of cool it over the last 6 months due to work pressure. Craig Armstrong is in square brackets because he sort of got burnt out. We got him to do so much in the first year, so he did a huge amount to get things going. So thank you very much, Craig, if you ever watch this. And Ross, over the last 6 months, 2 years, has done more and more and more on pretty much everything, although he was just saying parameterisation, and some input also from Roshane. So that's the structure of the working party. So we're going to sort of talk through the structure, the parameterisation, and then the results, but also, without wanting to give you too much of a spoiler, the sort of numerical results are going to be fairly sort of unshocking. So to help put them in perspective, we want to also give you some various points of comparison to benchmark them against. And an obvious point of comparison is the HIV/AIDS sort of, if you like, initially epidemic, and then, as you can see from that graph, something which tended down to something more manageable. So comparing against that, comparing against the phenomenon of adverse drug reactions, which seems like an interesting thing to compare it against. Compare it with the sort of excess winter deaths of a few years ago, compare it with the typical life insurance pandemic stresses, so help put things in perspective by comparing it against those tests as well. So that's hopefully enough introduction to get the ball rolling. So a bit of overview and background then. So hopefully this is it all sort of, as soon as you see this, you'll think this is all sort of intuitively obvious, but this is a very nice graphic which I found from the ONS. Hadn't seen this one until when I started sort of looking for more material for the slides recently. This is looking at top cause of death in the UK for males, and I'll sort of talk a bit at the end about how it's slightly different for females, but apologies for just choosing one gender here. So the basic construction is vertical axis is age, the horizontal axis, so the sort of top row is basically representing the decade, so the 15 top left represents the sort of decade 1910 to 1919. Then you've got the 1920s, 1930s, and so on, right up until the current decade over on the right. And you can see a big blob of green on the left. Green is infectious mortality, and then the basic story here is big blob of green. So infectious mortality is the major killer for this sort of working man's age from sort of 15 to 55. And then in the 1940s, that basically shifts over to other things, as infectious diseases are pretty much killed off, so lots of puns like these, and replaced by motor vehicle incidents or heart conditions, depending on your age group. So antibiotics very much behind that massive eradication of infectious disease there. So that's I think, a very striking graphic. Just for the sake of interest, the female equivalent is very similar, but the massive blue blob at the bottom with heart conditions taking over is for females much less blue, much more of the sort of rosy-coloured blocks representing cancer. That's the main difference. So another graph representing the same sort of phenomenon, but it's a bit more sort of quantified, if you like, a bit less simplistic, but not going into the underlying causes, is this. So trends in infectious disease mortality. Now this is US, but the UK is very much the same story. I've got this US one because it's actually a nice split between infectious and non-infectious. I couldn't find precisely this one for UK data. So all-cause mortality, sort of top line, that's broken down into non-infectious in light blue and infectious in the sort of rosy purple colour. And also you've got sort of years on the horizontal axis. And you can see there, while non-infectious cause of death is sort of pretty much constant roughly over the whole period, you've got infectious diseases really shooting down with the obvious of 1918 Spanish flu spike there. What's also quite interesting, which has sort of germane to the talk, is that antibiotics would have been kicking in the 1940s, but you've actually the antibiotic era, you can see there's been a massive reduction there. So antibiotics is not the sort of, if you like, the be-all and end-all to sorting out infectious disease mortality. There had been a huge improvement from such aspects as better health, hygiene, sanitation, and vaccination programs. So even if, in the worst possible case, antibiotics were to sort of disappeared and we went back to the 1940 level, it's still nothing like the Middle Ages, and it's still a long, long, long way below the blue line. Albeit that certainly the AB has had very substantial reductions and pretty much wiped out infectious disease mortality in developed countries. The other interesting thing I like about this graph is going back to the non-blue line. It does show you that there have been very long periods in many countries where mortality basically stays constant, and that there is no sort of law that it has to be improving by 1 or 2% a year, or whatever else the regulator might think. So, a bit of a tangent there. So, antibiotics, it's a bit of sort of a tangent here, but I think it's very interesting, both from my own sort of personal aspect and also a small history lesson, because a lot of my personal interest in this is due to sort of a family connection. So, my grandfather on my father's side was a surgeon. He ended up in the Second World War as sort of head of the Royal Army Medical Corps in Italy, overseeing the IMC operations in the Italian campaign in World War II. And the reason that's of particular interest here is because he was actually the first person to sort of see all the potential for antibiotics from the individual case studies coming out of various hospitals in London in sort of 1940-41, and sort of oversaw its mass deployment in the Italian campaign in 1943. Which was of interest, obviously, personally to me, but also a lot of the history books only sort of have it kicking in the sort of the D-Day operations from 1944 onwards. So if you've sort of learned one thing for your sort of extra CPD boost, it's the a year of extra sort of history there. So anyway, that explains some of my personal interest in the subject. So, a bit of medical background now. What is ABI? How does it occur? Well, what's really happening is you've got if you're not sure if you can read the font there, but the basics of pictures hope to tell a pretty tale. You have bacteria cells in the human body sort of doing their nasty thing in sort of circle number 1, which perhaps represents a petri dish. Number 2, some of the antibiotics come along and kill some of the bacteria, so you see the sort of kill bacteria with the black crosses, but that then leaves a couple who have survived, and by the fact that they've survived the antibiotics, that means they've got some form of innate antibiotic resistance, presumably accrued due to sort of random mutations in the past, and those in petri dish number 3 multiply, and that causes a mass spread of the antibiotic resistance, all sort of common sense, so basically a survival of the fittest sort of thing. The reason that's particularly problematic, though, is that you have both the sort of, if you like, the normal sort of father to child, sort of a lot of these sort of bacteria children, father to child type reproduction going on, and this sort of generation here is only of the order of 20 minutes, so obviously going to have a lot of reproduction going on, sort of like breeding like rabbits, but even faster. And also, which is even more cunning and worrying, is that they can have this sort of transmissibility of the, if you like, the genetic know-how as to how to beat the antibiotics from across siblings. So it's not just a vertical thing, it's also horizontal, which obviously exacerbates the problem. And this isn't a new concept, because even back in 1928, when Sir Alexander Fleming first sort of discovered the extraordinary thing that is penicillin, he sort of realised that this was on the cards, that, you know, for any antibiotic there would eventually be some sort of resistance growing due to this process. So it's not a new concept. Sources of resistance, apologies, the font here is a bit small, but the main concept is obviously what you've seen in the previous slide, that sort of antibiotics being deployed on humans, and that, if you like, naturally gives rise to antibiotic resistance. There's also a degree of misuse of antibiotics, which sort of exacerbates that again. So you have misuse in the sense of somebody is given, for instance, a 7-day course of antibiotics, they stop taking it after 5 days because they feel fine, which allows more bacteria to survive than would otherwise be the case. So those sort of couple of extra days allow more bacteria to survive, and they then sort of reproduce. There's the sort of overprescription of antibiotics, which is being handled reasonably well in the UK, with sort of doctors being harder and harder on the issue of antibiotics. But in many other countries, France and Italy spring to mind, there's a mass overuse of antibiotics. There's also a lot of self-prescription. So in many countries, again, Italy springs to mind. There's a sort of a marital connection there. That, you know, you can just go into the pharmacist and buy your own antibiotics and sort of prescribe it to yourself or your children. So that's all sort of completely out of control. There's very other interesting ways in which antibiotics can get into the system and lead to more and more growth of antibiotic resistance. So one of them is animal husbandry. So antibiotics actually being used on animals as a form of growth treatment to make them bigger and stronger, or at least higher yielding. And the figure I sort of saw recently was actually 40%, quite a staggering 40% of total antibiotics production is going into animal husbandry, which is quite staggering if you think about it. It's not even there to sort of, like, cure the animals, it's there just as a thing to give them automatically to make them grow faster and sort of increase the farmer's profits. Another interesting source is the fact that a lot of the antibiotics being produced, albeit by factories owned by firms with sort of reputable names in USA or Germany or whatever, they're being produced in factories in India and China, where the sort of controls are slightly laxer. From the factories leaks quite a lot of the antibiotics in the sort of process, and that is in countries where there's a huge amount of effluent waste products in the local rivers, and that combination of some of the antibiotics going to the rivers full of acute bacteria, obviously sort of means there's a huge amount of antibacterial resistance developing in those rivers full of effluent. So some other sort of interesting sources. So the whole sort of range of different ways that antibiotics can become resistant is quite staggering, really. That's probably enough on that rather depressing note. So how does ABR affect us and our work? Well, morbidity, mortality, lots of different ways, really. So I mean, in this talk, we're going to start to try and quantify both the mortality and the morbidity aspects, or rather, sorry, in the work of the party work, we've been quantifying mortality and morbidity aspects. In the actual slides towards the end, we'll also give some quantifications on the mortality aspects and leave morbidity to be read about in the paper. But mortality can affect you in many different ways. We've got sort of an age range there at the bottom. So in sort of younger ages, you could be obviously affected by meningitis. It's a very nasty sort of illness on children. There's routine cuts and grazes. As you get older, treatments such as chemotherapy, which is a huge number of people go through that in the UK, of the order of magnitude of 100,000 or so. And that's typically associated with preventive antibiotic use because the body is so weakened. So that depends on antibiotics to work. So major surgery such as heart surgery or joint replacement, again, there's use of antibiotics for that. And there's also, if you like, direct normal infections such as pneumonia. And for all of these, we depend on antibiotics to work. And if antibiotics stop working, then clearly there's going to be a substantial increase in, or potentially a substantial increase in mortality due to those causes. So hopefully that's fairly clear. In terms of the actual biochemistry, this is probably not the most complex of biochemical slides you've ever seen, but there's sort of two basic ways that antibiotics work. One is sort of bactericidal, sort of coming along and basically sort of dismantling the cell wall of the bacteria, so allowing the body's immune system to finish off the job. And the other is bacteriostatic, where the antibiotics in some way gets inside the bacteria. It's still actually relatively not entirely clear exactly how the mechanisms work, and there's some sort of debate in an article in Scientific American even just 5 years ago, a sort of spat between scientists as the exact mechanism of how some of these work, and we'll come back to that in a moment because the knowledge here affects the success of developing new antibiotics. What it's doing there is going into the sort of inside the cell and sort of trying to kill off the cell's mitochondria and so on. So those are the two basic strategies that explosions there, no sound effects, that they're working. Now, the sort of major institutions such as the World Health Organization are sort of very, very worried about antibiotic resistance. I mean, there's a sort of nice quote from the head of the WHO, probably sounds better if you call it the WHO, 6 or 7 years ago, he's saying, we're heading for an era where even the most routine of scratches or knee grazes could lead to mortality in very many cases, and that sort of impact. So they've been monitoring it very closely. They sort of recently released yet another sort of high priority list of bacteria, particularly both associated with high mortality and also associated with resistance to some of the major antibiotics. And if you've got good eyesight there at the top, the sort of critical box there, there's a box at the top three there with the sort of label of carbapenem-resistant bacteria. So carbapenem is one of the sort of two strongest antibiotics there is. So as soon as bacteria start thriving and are resistant to one of the strongest antibiotics, you've got quite a serious problem. And there are also other bacteria starting to develop resistance to, I have to consult my notes here. There's another equally sort of last resort antibiotics similar to carbapenem, which some of these bacteria are becoming resistant to. And again, that's a combination of high mortality and in being increasingly resistant to the major antibiotics is a cause of great concern. So of those three in the top box, they're sort of responsible for a range of different things. So pneumonia, blood infections. It's quite interesting as you sort of do more research, you find that some of these can be associated with completely different things. So, for instance, the top one there is sort of related to both pneumonia and bloodstream infections and meningitis. Others, again, sort of cover a range of different things. There's not just one bacteria for one particular type of disease. So that sort of led us to sort of think through what we're going to be having in our model, and we've ended up with sort of choosing basically these three to concentrate on. And as we'll talk about with Ross, we end up sort of looking more at the bottom one there, which is normally referred to as E. coli, which you'll already be reasonably familiar with. E. coli is surprisingly unpleasant, and although you may have come across it in an unpleasant context in sort of gastroenteritis and so on, it can be completely be fatal, especially in third world countries where diarrhea and other sort of problems like that are sort of actually quite high-ranking causes of death. So the antibiotic development pipeline, you might sort of reasonably think that, given the sort of billions and billions of pounds or hundreds of billions of pounds of scientific development going on all around the world with all these pharmaceutical companies and the great progress of science and human knowledge, that everything would be hunky-dory. So it's actually quite surprising if you sort of think back even just to the development of, or the discovery and the development of penicillin back in 1928, that itself was pure serendipity, and it wasn't just leaving a petri dish and coming back a few days later and discovering something interesting. It was actually almost unique, or it was a unique combination of different circumstances about the air pressure, the sort of temperature, the length of time it was left there, and various other conditions. So it's extraordinary discovering penicillin in that way in the first place. And all of the other discoveries since then have also been, if you like, based on that aspect of serendipity. So we haven't been going off into laboratories and actually, if you like, working out how do antibiotics work on bacteria and then using that knowledge to create new bacteria. It's more a question of trial and error and going through vast numbers of organic compounds found in plants or found in the soil and testing these and then going through the various clinical stages. But over the last 30 years, there's basically no major class of antibiotics discovered, with one potential question mark I'll deal with in the bottom box. So there does seem to be sort of a great drying up there. And part of it, I think, is this problem that we don't sufficiently understand what's going on. So there's a degree of human hubris, thinking that we understand everything there is to be known, when so far most of it has been based on serendipity and trial and error. The middle point is also interesting, because in fact this comes from a sort of quotation from O'Neill, who sort of did the big O'Neill report a few years ago, and he was quoted in the House of Commons Select Report on AMR. And he was saying that basically that the market for development of these doesn't function. The reason it doesn't function is it's quite simple, because if you're a big pharma company, your main aim is to generate several hundred billion of future income from developing something like a statin or a drug to treat AIDS, which people then need to take for the rest of their lives. So we sort of come back to the HIV and AIDS towards the end, but you sort of remember the spike there, massive, or fairly significant deaths, and then sort of drop off as suitable treatments are discovered. If you sort of start giving them some of these treatments, they need to take them for the rest of their lives. So there's a very big incentive for the pharma companies to invest in discovering these. With antibiotics, the most you're going to be on them is a week, or a week, a year, or whatever it might be. So there's far less incentive to be spending lots of money developing that. And the interesting quotation there, since the review finished, more pharmaceutical companies have left this area of research than have gotten involved. So there's a big problem there with the whole financial dynamics and the way pharma works. Moving down to the bottom, rather than trying to put up a big list of what's in the official pipeline, I thought one nice way to approach this would be to look at the two, in an article in the Action magazine a couple of years ago, we cited these two as probably the most interesting new developments on the block. So it takes it back to initially hailed as a game changer. I mean, the reason it was seen as very significant was that in the past, a lot of the antibiotics have been, again, sort of sourced, if you like, by trial and error from the soil, but only a very small proportion of those actually sort of survive in typical sort of soil cultures for reasons I don't understand. But this technique there has allowed these things to be isolated and sort of cultured in a way that allows sort of roughly 100 times more potential antibiotic substances to be discovered and tested than before. So that was sort of initially thought of as very promising, but it's becoming sort of quite difficult and costly to produce, and the sort of mechanism of resistance has already been discovered or described, but that's now in phase 2 trials. And the other sort of promising thing was the development firm went bankrupt and got bought out, and again that's now in phase 2 trials. So there are things going on, but again it's not some rosy, go to the laboratory tomorrow and have something on the market in a year's time. It's a very, very long and fraught process, which doesn't, to be honest, seem to be producing much at all. So that's probably a suitably sort of negative way to end this section. In the absence of ever sort of, if like, a guaranteed pipeline of new antibiotics, well, what can we be doing? Well, every country is trying to work out sensible strategies to be tackling the problem, and that the UK announced its 5-year National Action Plan very recently, actually, and this is some sort of nice targets, halving sort of particular sort of bloodstream infection, and again, halving a particular infectious route doesn't actually seem all that difficult if you look at one of the graphs we show later, because in fact MRSA, we had a very successful campaign against MRSA in the sort of public health system through some fairly common sense things, such as just much more rigour around washing hands and so on. So there are ways to have a lot of progress without necessarily inventing a great new form of antibiotic. Reducing UK antimicrobial use in humans by 15%, which doesn't sound all that ambitious, And it's interesting, bottom ones, mass trying to go for a fairly severe reduction in antibiotic use in animals. So lots of things that we can be doing as a country over and beyond just pinning all our hopes on developing new antibiotics. So that's a quick whiz through the background. I'll hand over to Ross at this point.
All right. Thanks very much, Matthew, for the science and history lesson. I guess it's my turn to take everyone through a bit of the maths and statistics behind what we put together for the model, and trying to set out a bit of analysis on what our views are looking like for antibiotic resistance to both mortality and morbidity. So just a reminder, I'll take you quickly through the model structure. We'll then move on to parameterisation, and finally a quick look at some of the results that have come out of our analysis using the model so far. So the first step that we took as a working party to try and decide what model structure, and apologies, you can't really read what's on here, but essentially we did a literature review to see what models were out there, what we could use and what we could borrow, and what routes were most appropriate to take for our purposes. And it turns out there were actually 2 reviews which were systemic reviews across all the various different research papers out there, and they were extremely helpful in highlighting all the different types of models that people had used to look at antibiotic resistance. And these models varied depending on the purpose of what they were looking at, to what the structure of the model was, so for example, stochastic or deterministic, and also even the populations that they were looking at. So for example, you had some looking at resistance within animals, and obviously some within humans as well. So taking all these into consideration, we decided to go with a simplistic approach, so that it was able to be rolled out to a wide audience and people could parameterize it in their own way. And the chart you can see here is just some of the different options that were available to us in terms of the different pathways that you could look at as to how do people get infected, and how does the infection go from either being susceptible to antibiotics or resistant to antibiotics. And so the chosen structure that we went with is a multi-state Markov model. It met the criteria that we set out as a working group, and that is a fairly simple model. It's well understood by the actuarial community. There's good availability of data in terms of parameterizing the model, and it generates the appropriate outputs that we had set out within the terms of reference. So here you can see an example schematic of the multi-state Markov model. So we have 4 states. A healthy state, which actually incorporates people who are healthy but also could be sick with infections or ailments that aren't within the scope of the model. And then you have 2 sickness states. So you have one which is susceptible to antibiotics, so that the infection will actually be affected by the antibiotics, and a second state which the infection is resistant to the antibiotics. And then finally you have the terminal dead state as well. So moving on to parameterization, and here is a couple of screenshots from the model so far. And what you can see here is we have, if we look at actually the bottom table first, so just this one here, you have different information and data that you can actually populate the model with. So you can look at different kinds of populations depending on your purposes, and then based on that population that you're looking at, you can input the various observed death information and infection reporting information as well into there. And then there's a couple of extra inputs at the top here which allow you to put in some of the key factors which differentiate between a susceptible and a resistant infection. And one of the reasons we've had to split it out like this is because of availability of data, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail across the next slides. So now we had our model structure and we knew what kind of data we were going to need. We then took a step back to think about what antibiotics we were actually going to model. And so Matthew previously showed you the slide where our medical expert, Nicola, she had helped us narrow down the choice of bacteria from those that are on the WHO's watch list to a couple. And actually we've just set out here a chart which shows you the varying resistance over time to some of those bacteria to the in-scope antibiotics. And you can see that there are quite different trends across the different bacterias. In particular, if you look at this, and unfortunately the lines all seem to be a bit blue, which is unhelpful, but it is what it is. So if you look at the line that's starting here, which is MRSA, and Matthew mentioned earlier that there's been a very, very successful campaign in reducing, I'm not even going to try and say it, but methicillin resistance. And as you can see, in 2005, resistance was close to 50%, and that's now come way down to around about 15% over time. In contrast, we've got E. coli, which is this darkest blue line here. And E. coli has had a steadily rising resistance to third-generation cephalosporins, which I hope I've also pronounced correctly, and forgive me if I haven't. And you're actually seeing now MRSA and E. coli resistance levels are around about a similar point. Finally, there are the two other in-scope bacterias, and their resistance profiles look like they're either around about flat or maybe even slightly decreasing over time. So the working party decided that in the context of our analysis with the model, we were going to focus on E. coli and then consider approximate ways of allowing for various different other infections within that, but primarily just focusing on available E. coli data. So what is available? And this is extremely variable across the different infections. But there are some really, really useful resources out there for us to use that are most importantly free, which is great. So Public Health England has mandatory reporting on E. coli and its resistance, on E. coli reporting for infection rates and death rates. It also includes MRSA, MSSA as well, and there's a few others that have now been brought within scope but have limited data going back in history as well. You've then also got the ECDC, which is the European Centre for Disease Control, Office for National Statistics, and also any publicly available research papers that can be used to supplement gaps in the data. So the main piece of information parameters that we need to inform are infection rates, death rates, how long people are staying in hospital, and general overall mortality rates as well. And ideally, we need this data split across both resistant and susceptible strains. So taking a look at the ECDC, so they have a specific kind of area set up, which is called the European Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance Network, or EARSnet, which is much easier to say. And it's a really, really useful resource for looking at resistance levels across a multitude of different geographies, different bacteria, and different antibiotics that those bacteria might be resistant to. So to highlight one of the ones that Matthew mentioned before, so different bacteria respond to different antibiotics, but there's also kind of last line of defense bacteria as well. So I think it's colistin, for example, is quite an extreme antibacteria. There you go. Yeah, so it's quite an extreme antibiotic, and it's certainly it's one of those where if all else fails, you would be potentially prescribed this, but it's not given to you with a it's not given to you lightly, because it can cause significant other damage by taking it. So all these types of this type of analysis is collected by on EARSnet and is available to download. Notably for our purposes, there is information on the UK and Ireland separately, but there isn't a further breakdown across, for example, England, Scotland, Wales, etc. In addition, they have split out resistance across gender and also into some quite broad age groups as well. So this was a very, very helpful resource. So we then took the information available on EARSnet and we did a quick bit of analysis just to see how we want to parameterize the model and what were the useful segmentations that we want to include. So what you can see here is the proportion of resistance to proportion of E. coli resistance to third-generation cephalosporins, and the first chart at the top here is looking at the difference between males and females. And as you can see, whilst in earlier years there was a bit of a gap between male and female resistance, that's actually closed. And in general, the trend in resistance looks like it has a similar shape. In contrast, if we look at the bottom left chart, there is a much more variable trend across different age groups, and I'm not even going to try and pull one out in particular, but it looks like it's all over the place. So our conclusion from this was that we're going to model different age groups, but we're not going to differentiate between genders. So now we've set out what parameters are available, what data is available to inform those parameters. It's also worth noting that the information available on Public Health England, for example, on E. coli monitoring, does not differentiate between resistant infections and susceptible infections. So there was some element of having to overlay the EARS network data onto the Public Health England data to try and inform what levels of resistance and the number of resistant or susceptible reports, and also then supplement this information with research papers to inform what the difference in the mortality rate between resistance and susceptible infections. So if I just go back a couple of slides, I mentioned that there were these three inputs here. And so the top one here is this relationship between resistance and susceptible and the mortality rate between the two. And the reason we have to have that in there is because the reporting is just not there to inform what the relative mortality rate is for a resistant strain relative to a susceptible strain. And in the same way as well, in terms of how long people are staying in hospital with one or the other, there is some information out there, but it's not quite in the detail that we needed for the model. So we've had to put in this information available from various different research papers. So moving on to the results. Unsurprisingly, from Matthew's earlier slide, which shows that deaths caused by infection has pretty much been eradicated or is at extremely low levels. So if we take any data from the UK, or specifically we've looked at England in this case, and we use that data to inform the model over recent history, any sort of rise in resistance is not going to have a particularly material impact to overall life expectancies or differences in annual expected one-year probabilities of death. So the top line here is just a simple linear extrapolation of E. coli resistance all the way up to 2050, and just taking a point in 20 years' time, if we look at kind of the expected impact to life expectancy from that, we're looking at a reduction of possibly 0.2 to 0.3% across adult age groups, and that's a specific point which I'll come back on to later. If we instead look at a more severe scenario, so here we have resistance reaching 100% just for E. coli in the future, then that effect is about 3 to 4 times just a simple linear extrapolation. So even in quite an extreme scenario, it's not a particularly material impact in our view to overall life expectancies. So that's just varying resistance. Here, just for your information, so for the slides later, we've just got a chart setting out the details across the various different age groups that we've run, and just a brief overview of how this works. So we've got a kind of annual variance in the probability, the 1-year probability of death, the cumulative variance over 20 years, and just some illustrative life expectancy impacts there. So the second types of scenarios that we're running, now we've run through how does increasing resistance change over time, is what's the impact from changing infection rates over time. And this is slightly more material, because given that we have such low infection rates within the UK, then actually any impact to increasing infection rates does have a slightly more meaningful impact as you project this over time. So the first scenario that we run is just to double the number of infections that are within scope. So this is one method you can use within the model, which will just allow you to capture other infections in a simplistic way. And unsurprisingly, this just ends up almost doubling the outcome at the end. So, for example, by 2050, the cumulative effect of having doubled infection rates is to increase the probability of death by around 0.16% by 2050. So still not particularly material impact. In contrast, if we then allow for increasing resistance over time, and so why might you do this? Well, there's likely to be some link between the number of infections and the level of resistance over time. So, for example, as resistance rates increase and more people have the infection, it's quite possible that this will be passed on to other people in whatever setting. So in order to explore this, the model has the capability where you can allow for a variable resistance over time. And so one example that I've run here is just to have an annual increase of 2.5% in infection rates. And this leads to a cumulative impact to QX of nearly 4% by 2050. And to just put that into perspective, that would be roughly a reduction of around 2% to life expectancies at that point. So still, even with these quite extreme scenarios, this is still not particularly material given other causes of mortality improvements or worsening over time. And again, we've got a chart here just setting out various different scenarios just for you to take a look at. All of this will be included within the Sessional research paper as well. So just to draw this to a close, one interesting difference that has come out of the research is actually the differences across various age groups. So we saw progressively throughout, as people progress throughout their adult life, that the impact of rising resistance was more material to those as you got older, but not particularly significantly more material. However, when you reach children, in particular those under 1 year of age, the cumulative increase to probability of dying, the relative cumulative increase to probability of dying was around 1.5 to 2 times that of other age groups. And that was quite surprising at first. However, if you look a little bit more at the data underlying this, actually infant mortality is actually relatively low in the UK and has been decreasing over time. However, when you consider all the causes of deaths within infants, actually infection rates, deaths caused by E. coli, as an example, represents around 2% of total deaths for children under 1. And this is actually a much higher proportion than other age groups which have other causes of death. It is worth noting, though, that the fatality rates for infants that do have E. coli is actually much lower than other age groups. So this actually further increases the impact of E. coli being quite an important factor in variable infant mortality rates into the future. And so one example, just put at the bottom, is if we include one of our kind of heavy resistance scenarios and encompass a wide variety of bacteria, and also there's a link between resistance rates and infection rates over time, then you could have an extra 80 infant deaths across England and Wales, which is actually quite a material number, given that there's only 2,700 a year at the kind of most recent count. So that's everything I want to take you through on the results. So I'm just going to hand back to Matthew just to take you through some of the conclusions and to wrap up. Thanks very much.
That's where I get to be reunited with my glass of water. Yeah, gasping. So just 2 slides left and going through the results from a slightly different perspective. So Ross was basically taking through, if you like, the absolute impacts on mortality. And just as we were sort of going through those scenarios, one of the things we initially sort of postulated was as a plausible scenario for sort of linear or even exponential antibiotic resistance growth up for 15, 20, 25 years and then sort of tending back down as things are cured, and we sort of basically had to stop looking at that because it gave a result of almost no interest whatsoever. So where we have got results which show things being fairly unshocking, that is, as being in the context we've been trying to find scenarios which would sort of be material. If we could have envisaged a huge, wider range of scenarios where things are even more benign. So anyway, so various comparison points here. So the first one was just thinking through, and this is sort of stimulated by some of the Q&A we've had in previous sessions down in Staple Inn. How does all this compare with HIV/AIDS deaths? Well, the graph here, the sort of basic numbers here, that after sort of late 90s, the number of deaths in the UK in the region of 500, 400, that sort of thing. So hundreds of deaths, several hundred deaths a year. I think the most recent statistic I saw was 480 or something from a couple of years ago. And that clearly compares with a sort of much higher rate of mortality back in the late 1980s, 1990s, and at that time, clearly the profession was getting quite worried this was going to be sort of carrying on and on and on. So it's an interesting sort of analogous point. So what happens if we look at our scenarios in the model and compare it against these? Well, the basic answer is that our model is giving, depending on exactly which scenario you look at and which year in that scenario, of the order of 400 or 500, 600 deaths a year. So it's very much analogous to the, if you like, intensity of mortality we're getting from HIV/AIDS at the moment. So that would be a useful way to benchmark it. Another interesting way to put it in perspective, given that some of the headlines have been quite demonstrative, is comparing with what we get from deaths from adverse drug reactions, which is conveniently a, sort of a similar, or conveniently or confusingly a very similar acronym, ADR, adverse drug reactions, where it's basically just people dying because they sort of react badly to the drugs they're given in hospital or pre-hospital, and a lot of that seems to be caused by polypharmacy, where so people are given sort of 5, 10 different drugs, and those drugs are obviously tested in isolation in general. So here you've got ADR giving you of the order of 3,000 to 4,000 deaths a year. So the ABR deaths are going to be an order of magnitude, it's a factor of 10-ish lower than that. So that's what helps to put things in perspective. Another sort of point of comparison, you can sort of see the way this is going, is how does this compare with the excess winter deaths in 2015? And again, if you do the comparison in 2015, the general stats we had of the order of 30,000 more deaths than we were expecting. So the ABR deaths would be sort of the order of 2 orders of magnitude, as a factor of 100 below that. So again, it's a way down on the scale. And the other sort of comparison point we were asked for one of the other sessions some months ago was how does this compare with typical pandemic risk modelling. So the standard formula, so for those of you who are sort of working the pensions side of life, then the insurers have to cope with Solvency II, which you've no doubt heard about in fun events like this. So for mortality catastrophe, you need to allow for a 1.5 per mil mortality shock. In other words, take your QX and just add 1.5 or 0.0015 to the QX rates and calculate the effect of that every year. So the ABR impact from our models is of the order of 25 years, 25 a factor below that. In other words, it takes 20 or 25 years worth of exposure on our model to get anywhere close to the standard formula shock. So again, it's another point of comparison. It's way below what you'll get on the pandemic risk shock according to the standard formula. And just put that 1.5 per minute in context, that compares with approximately 5 per minute at the time of the Spanish flu. So these sort of regulators generally see that they sort of increased healthcare and so on, it sort of justifies a sort of mortality rate of the order of 1/3 of what we had in the Spanish flu many years ago. So we've looked at things then in sort of absolute terms from what Ross was doing, in relative terms here. Things aren't looking too shocking. But the sort of strange thing, though, is it's attempting to model effectively the existing infectious disease mortality. And as we sort of hinted at in one of the earlier slides, there's a huge use of antibiotics in a more preventive context, sort of helping patients undergoing heart surgery or chemotherapy, joint replacement, all that sort of thing. We use antibiotics because their bodies are going to be much weaker and much more susceptible to infection. So what's going on there? Well, there's a huge number of different things where antibiotics are relied on and taken for granted, and this is a list of some of the most, if you like, popular options. We sort of rely on antibiotics for all of these. So there's a sort of huge, if you like, exposed to risk of people going through these, and what happens if those people can no longer rely on their antibiotics. Well, these are also rather order of magnitude figures, and it makes me think of that sort of old joke about the actuary in the countryside who looks at some sheep on the hill and says, well, I can see 1,003 sheep, and his colleague or friend says, how do you calculate that? And he says, well, there are exactly 3 sheep in that field over there, and it looks like there are roughly 1,000 over there. And then we're sort of heading to a similar way with this. We've done some very detailed modelling with lots of work to produce the rates we saw. But on the other hand, some of these may in the end be swamped by this sort of different effect purely from what's happening with ABR resistance or ABR in the context of preventive usage. So approximate figures based on recent stats in the UK got of the order of 100,000 surgical procedures outlined above, so it's roughly 80,000 of the cardiac, 20,000 joint replacement. Chemotherapy, again, of the order of magnitude of around about 100,000. Infections, you might expect of the order of 10% infection rate. And the way our model is working, if antibiotic resistance grows the way it's predicting, we've got a mortality rate from resistant bacteria, which are going to give us roughly 5,000 a year of death. So that's of the order of perhaps getting on for 10 times what we were predicting just from the growth in infectious disease mortality per se. So quite a big impact there, but again, it's much potentially more in the future. It's also much more likely to be on the pensioner side of life than the assured lives, which if you're sort of a callous annuity manager or pension fund guy, then clearly that's working in your direction from a financial perspective. And also if you sort of think of the mechanics as a bit of double counting with the previous work we were doing as well. So that's sort of a potentially more shocking thought, but again one which is much harder to quantify given the data we've got and given the modelling resources we've been able to apply. So it's not all completely rosy as you might have thought from the previous slides. There is still a potential problem down the line, but clearly not a sort of a longevity improvement problem. So that takes up to Q&A, and hopefully there will be a good number of Q and potentially an equal number of A, but who knows.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen. The discussion's now open to you. Anyone interested in making some points like to raise their hands at this stage so I can get some gauge of how many questions we're likely to get? As many as that. That's good to know. Right, I shall. Can I remind you that you are being recorded, so when I call on you, could you give your name and please clearly speak into the microphone when it reaches you either. There are some roving mics and there are also some fixed mics as well. And I can also remind you that those yet less than 15 years qualified are eligible for the Sloan Prize for the best question. We're not allowed to call them younger members. Anyway, can I ask who would like to make our first point? There's a man there that put his hand up earlier, so you.
Thank you very much to Matthew and Ross for a very interesting talk. Actually, it's a couple of questions, really. Modelling work seems to have focused on E. coli and the impact on that on mortality. If you were to expand the range of bacteria that you're studying, how would that, what's your gut feel about how would that change your conclusions? And the second is, I'd be interested in knowing how much of a time commitment you had to put in to model the work that you've done so far. And how much extra would it be to build up and maybe cover all the material, bacteria you'd be interested in looking at?
Hopefully that works. Thanks for the question. So the first one on expanding the range, and this is one which is quite limited depending on the data availability. So there's pretty good data available for E. coli, but as soon as you start to, and even MRSA as well, but as soon as you start to move outside of that, the data's just not quite there. There is in the works, for anyone who's looked at it, there's I think it's called the ICDC coding system for how the NHS records what infections people have or what issues people have, and then uses that recording to put in the system, and that goes to inform some of the statistics that get produced. And that's actually being revised to include those that are resistant or susceptible to various different antibiotics. So there's something in the works, but it's going to be quite a long time before anything comes in to actually improve that data recording. And so what we've done is just to use the good data available on E. coli and then just scale that up. And there's obviously limitations with doing that because, is the thing causing an increase in resistance that in E. coli exactly the same as what's causing an increase to MRSA, for example. And so there's limitations there. So that's the first one on expanding the range, and ultimately by taking a simplistic approach, then it's effectively just kind of doubling the output. So to the extent you increase that range, it kind of doubles the output. But given deaths caused by infections is not particularly material in the UK anyway, then it still doesn't make much of a dent in your conclusions. And then the second point was on time spent modelling. So we've been going at this for around about 2 years on and off. There's been a lot of thought that's gone into this, and actually, in my opinion, one of the most valuable outputs of this piece of research is actually the thought that's gone into it, the suggested avenues that can come out of it to inform future research. And so I think a lot of work has gone into this. It's going to be relatively easy and quick to use the model and reparameterize it with whatever data you manage to find. It also shouldn't be too difficult to expand the model if you wish to as well. So a lot's gone into it, and hopefully it forms the basis for future research as well.
Oh, not so complicated. No, thanks very much. Very, very good answer. So, I mean, just a couple of points on that also. When we were sort of initially thinking of the model, we were thinking we would end up with several bacteria for which there was sort of some data, and then have sort of a thorny issue towards the end of how to sort of, if you like, aggregate those different ones. So, the silver lining of the lack of data was that it actually made the aggregation much simpler because you're segregating one risk, if you like, with itself. And so the sort of times two is obviously fairly blunt way of allowing for that, but it was sort of, despite looking fairly blunt, a sort of a serious way of sensibly allowing for all the other bacteria, certainly in terms of order of magnitude. And the other point more on the second question was in terms of modelling, again, sort of echoing Ross's point, that a lot of the time involved has been spent on the thinking, and in particular thinking through what data is available, what approaches would work, and so on. And it sort of, I guess, resonates with my philosophy of modelling, that a model isn't there to produce a number. A model is there to help you sort of understand what's going on as you go through the model and develop the model. So in that, to that extent, I think it's been very useful and hopefully of use to the actuarial profession as a whole. And I suppose one thing, looking back, it's probably almost the breaking point at which the working parties of volunteers doesn't really work if you've got a lot of analytic type work being done by people in a volunteer capacity where they which is actually quite different from their day job. So it wasn't the case that we could suddenly get lots of juniors to go and do all the work for us. So it's probably a sort of a lesson for the future, certainly the next time we think of volunteering for something.
Well, probably not for lack of trying. I think you were trying to rope in interns all summer, but yeah.
Do we have another point? Roger?
Thank you. Roger Austin. Just taking that last question a little bit further, I'm quite interested. It's surprised me, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one, as to how low some of those numbers were. And it would be interesting to know if we looked at an extreme scenario. So, like, say, within 10 years, all the antibiotics were totally resistant. What kind of impact would that have? You know, we saw that interesting graph that, you know, going from the start of the century, mortality was falling, but it didn't fall as much as I would have expected from the 1940s onwards. So it was just to understand if any thought had been given to that, really.
Flip back a few slides to, yeah, we've got some different scenarios that we've run. So this third one down here is the, we have this is an absolute increase, but sorry, fifth one down, 100% resistance in 2050, and we've doubled the infection rates as well. And certainly my opinion on this one is it's still not a particularly material impact. You know, you've got annual variances to QX of less than 0.1%, and cumulative variances of 2 to 3% by 2050. So even in 10 years, it's not going to be particularly material. And I think that's just a function of the current rates and how the majority of people aren't dying from infectious disease. They're dying from other causes. But as Matthew mentioned earlier, the second order impacts have not really been fully explored within this model, and actually are really, really difficult to even try and quantify. And that is, take cancer as a classic example. So if you had extremely high resistance rates, would people be able to get chemotherapy? Would they be able to survive chemotherapy to the same extent that they do at the moment? And actually, that's not really captured by this model at the moment, and it's certainly an area I'd quite like to see further work and development on, because that would certainly be the kind of the scary impact of increasing resistance.
I mean, the basic answer we got, it was, with that table going down to the bottom, you still see it's still an order of magnitude below typical mortality improvement rates, whether for term or for pensioners. And just to clarify, in case we didn't clarify this before, or it wasn't obvious, that these are also, if like, multiplicative numbers. So plus 0.3% to Q doesn't mean 0.3% Q in absolute terms. It means times 1.003 after many years.
Another point someone would like to make? Patrick?
Sorry, Patrick Kelleher. I just want to confirm my understanding. So what you've modelled is E. coli in terms of both standalone infections, so somebody having dodgy curry or something like that, but also people contracting E. coli in a hospital environment. Is that correct? So actually, it does actually reflect not just standalone infections, but also kind of opportunistic infections that come through basically as part of medical procedures. Okay, excellent. So I just really I couldn't understand the difference between the 500 or 600 excess deaths you got and the 5,000 or so you got towards the end. Sorry.
So the point is that all the detailed work that's been done has been based on infectious diseases where you're actually looking at someone who's got the infection and dies, or some of them won't die, but it's all about deaths from, if you like, known infectious disease now, as opposed to the use of antibiotics in areas of prophylactic or preventive. Sorry, one way. context whereby people undergoing all these different treatments in hospital are given antibiotics, because if they're not given antibiotics, then there's a very good chance they will accrue an infection in hospital. You know, not so much because the hospital's filthy, that as well, but also because they're just very, very weakened by the process. So it's sort of back of envelope figures, which clearly is a back of envelope partly due to the lack of time and resources, but also just the nature of the data doesn't allow a full job as we had done on the other sort of half. So you know, this gave us a back of envelope figure that of the order of magnitude of 5,000-ish deaths, possibly from this source of preventive prophylactic use of antibiotics no longer working.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the data we've looked at includes both healthcare associated infections and also those that are picked up elsewhere. So I guess depending on what data you look at depends on whether you're looking at the kind of community or healthcare setting.
Yeah, I was sort of interested with the comparison with AIDS, and having remembered, you know, how back in the 80s, how worried the profession was about AIDS mortality, and I wondered if you know, the fact was that AIDS was actually quite difficult to transmit, and people changed behaviours, and drugs were developed which, if not curing it, did keep people alive. You know, so it wasn't resistant. So I'm just wondering if there was a new disease that was more easily transmissible, therefore infection spread quickly and it became resistant. I wonder, maybe I'm being doom and gloom, but are there scenarios where this could be much more serious than the models are currently showing?
Yeah, I suppose the nub of the question then is the sensitivity to transmissibility. So at the moment, our sort of parameters on the actual number of infections, we aren't sort of increasing them massively. I think we saw in the bottom extreme projection we just talked about, we're sort of increasing the infection rate annually by 2.5%. So it's not massive. So in other words, we're sort of looking at, if you like, known bacteria, but the sort of known unknowns or unknown knowns, known bacteria who have a known property of antibiotic resistance developing at a known unknown rate, as opposed to some completely new transmission mechanism. So that, again, could be a sort of a doom and gloom scenario, which I guess is what the pandemic risk shock is for on the insurance balance sheet. I mean, the other interesting thing with the HIV comparison is I suppose, we mentioned the sort of pharmaceutical companies' sort of financial imperative that they were keen to develop things which people would be on for the next 50 years, as opposed to spending billions to develop something which someone's going to be on for just 1 week. The other thing, as you said, was the change of behaviour. So with AIDS, there's some massive changes in behaviour, which obviously were very successful, whereas with ABR it's much harder to get people to sort of not to want to get some antibiotics from their doctor, especially for their children.
Paul Grace was looking at me earlier.
Thank you. Paul Grace. My points are more comments than questions. There were some early slides which referred to the action being taken by the NHS, trying to encourage doctors to prescribe antibiotics less, testing people's current conditions to such that they are prescribed a more appropriate antibiotic. I'm not too sure to what extent the NHS, given the figures we've seen this evening, to what extent the NHS action is really as necessary as one might think. Certainly, I think what has come out is that although at the moment with NHS, the kind of level of prescribing antibiotics has probably led to people recovering more quickly from minor infections and thus improving the quality of their life. It doesn't necessarily that they need the antibiotics. They may well recover more quick in any event. That's the first point I wanted to make. The other point was you referred to the fact that there's been no major new antibiotics type developed in the last 30 years. And then you made one of the comments was that there were two manufacturers that effectively pulled out in recent years. Is that because they've possibly developed similar models to yourselves and see limited need for the development?
Thanks. I'm not sure if I won't really answer the first one because it's more of a comment, but I think I agree with what you're saying in your first comment. But I guess as a sideline to that, I mean, those sort of 5 NHS or Public Health England actions all looked fairly minor. But again, if you're in their position, you have to do something. And what has been quite impressive, as we saw from the MRSA graph, was actually a collection of what at the time sounded like fairly mundane measures did actually end up having a massive success rate in very significantly reducing the MRSA infectious mortality. But on the second point, it's really just the financial dynamics in that there's this point that sort of actually finding an antibiotic that works is an incredibly sort of laborious trial and error process. And in the one of the books I was going to recommend as further reading is by the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, called When the Drugs Don't Work. And it's a very good read. And she has this example of a recent, well, probably 10 or 15 years ago now, one of the major drug firms had a sort of program. They basically went through 500,000 possible organic compounds using sort of computer modelling to work out which was sort of sensible to actually create and then test those on petri dishes and then go on to phase 1, then phase 2, then phase 3. And of those 500,000 initially laid out on the table, not a single one got through to phase 3 trials. It's just an incredibly costly R&D process. I mean, if you did have something going into phase 2 trials, it would be costing you of the order of sort of $5 or $10 million or pounds, and phase 3 trials of the order of 50 or 100 million. It's, even if you get to that stage, so it's incredibly costly. And at the moment, the big pharma companies would much rather be pushing something like statins or blood pressure control drugs or whatever.
It's kind of an economical problem as to how drug companies are compensated for the research that they do, and ultimately, if you take a week's worth of antibiotics, costing whatever that costs, it's significantly lower value to them than long-term drugs. So, one of the outcomes of the O'Neill review was to recommend a fresh look at how drug companies are compensated for looking at various different elements of research to try and encourage them to look at this in more detail. So there's a kind of structure and economical argument there.
Matthew, you're going to give us a few last slides.
Oh, yes.
Afraid we've got to that point of the evening.
So just by way of wrapping up then, next steps, again with apologies for not everything not already being up on the website. It has been a sort of a labour of love. So model undergoing peer review and should be available on the IFOA website very soon, meaning in the next few weeks. Again, likewise, the sessional paper, which will include a sort of a simple model user guide, and we're also sort of trying to discuss with the institute and faculty. It's a bad mistake to make up here. Having some sort of press release about this, because I think it would be clear of interest with our conclusions as they are. And further reading, as I was just mentioning, some sort of interesting ways to sort of take it forward without sort of destroying too many brain cells is a very good sort of 100-page type read from the Chief Medical Officer and a pound or something like that on Kindle. The one in the middle is very, very good. So it talks about many different sort of incredible developments in medicine over the last 50 years, of which the first one is the development of antibiotics. That's a very good read. I think that's £2 on Kindle. The longevity bulletin we had on ABR a couple of years ago is sort of very slightly out of date, but the things are sort of most of the truths remain true. And obviously lots of websites full of fun ABR facts, which is listed a few there. So that's really it. So thank you very much again for your patience.
Now, I'd like to invite Alan Ray to summarise tonight's discussion.
Thank you. I think it's been a very interesting presentation, interesting discussion. The fact that the Professor Dame Sally Davies had made such a significant statement caused the mortality research steering group to set up the working party. The working party has done a lot of work, hard work over number of years. And the modelling, I think, in some ways refutes her assertion that this will be a significant event in terms of mortality improvements. Although I think a number of the areas we've seen, we are sort of pushing the limits of modelling, and we're extrapolating what we know rather than what we don't know. But it was, the historical aspect was quite, I think the authors pointed out that the infectious diseases have become such a small thing that even if they get worse again, it may not be, in pure mortality terms, the worst thing. I think we had some interesting questions. Again, people questioning about mostly about the size and the modelling as to whether indeed this is as potentially insignificant as it seems. And I think Paul Grace made an interesting point at the end. It may, in mortality terms, not be the biggest thing, but to some extent in terms of quality of life of certain people who currently take it for granted that they can take a week's antibiotics and be cured. That might be a bigger issue, and a bigger issue for the NHS in terms of cost. I think my conclusion, and I'll apologise in advance for my sense of humour. Matthew mentioned the World Health Organization, and I was sort of reminded of Doctor Who's arch enemy, the Daleks, whose favourite phrase was "resistance is futile." I think if you're a bacteria, resistance clearly is not futile. It is working. It may not appear to be as critical to us, but I think my takeaway from this was that perhaps we as actuaries can encourage the government to find a way to promote, if you like, a better response in terms of drug development, because there may be some issues coming down the line that we will need to respond to. But
thank you, Alan. And thank you very much for your efforts to get the word Dalek in the British Actuarial Journal. I can sense a competition coming on. It remains for me to express my own thanks, and hopefully the thanks of all of you, for those who've participated this evening, the working party, tonight's presenters, our closer, and all those who asked questions. It'd be helpful if those of you who've actually said something this evening, if you've got any prepared notes or anything, please hand them to the Institute and faculty staff that are here this evening. That will help with publication of the British Actuarial Journal. And finally, please show your appreciation for this evening's talk.